I want to address the question of what are the origins of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think the only way to start with such a huge question that is already being discussed by so many people, and there are so many books about what is the origin and what is the year that you want to start considering it, is to attack the word conflict. I think the word conflict is extremely misleading. And you hear it so many times, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that people don't really stop to think about what does the word bring to this discussion? What do we learn when we use the word conflict? I think the problem with the word is that it evokes the image as if there are two sides, and the two sides hate each other, or they have a problem with each other, and they meet each other on the field of battle and have some kind of conflict with each other. And the conflict takes many forms. It can be a political conflict, an economic conflict, and so on. But in the end, the conflict creates a false idea of some kind of balance between two different groups. And that has never been the case. That is not what the story of Zionism and the story of Palestine in the 19th and 20th and 21st century is about. The story is about unequal power relations. And within these unequal power relations, the sides have not always been very clear who is on which side. So this is, when you want to talk about a conflict and you want to talk about sides, you have to identify which are the people on the sides. And what do you do when people jump all the time between the two sides? Maybe you have to rethink your paradigm and say maybe it's not exactly about two sides at all. Maybe there are more than two. Maybe it's more about one movement or group of people concentrating power, fighting to concentrate that power, and a lot of different groups and movements are trying to attack that group and to have a more equal distribution of power, of wealth, of land, not necessarily between Jews and Palestinians, certainly not necessarily between Israelis and Palestinians, because the word Israeli is, again, sort of anachronistic. We want to talk about a history that starts mainly in the 19th century, where there was no state of Israel, or the very early 20th century. The state of Israel only started in 1948. So Palestine was a province within the Ottoman Empire. It was not an independent state. The people living there were called Palestinians. Are they a nation? At some point, they started thinking of themselves as a nation, just like every European nation at some point started to think of itself as a nation. But that's really not the important issue. The important issue is that this province has undergone many historical processes, including ethnic cleansing and wars, and what I would consider to be a civil war over a period of about 100 years. And now there is 100 years to the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration, I think, can serve as a very good sort of starting point to explain how this struggle begins. And I'll say struggle instead of conflict in order to try to break out of this box of the established discourse on this history. So if when the Ottoman Empire controlled Palestine, it already had to give extra rights to people who were not citizens of the Ottoman Empire, but were actually foreign citizens. And that's something that we usually don't think about today, because usually modern states give extra rights to their own citizens and inferior rights to foreigners. The Ottoman Empire, however, was under extreme pressure by European powers, by the Russian Empire, by the British Empire and the French Empire, to give their citizens more rights than to their own citizens. And those privileges for foreigners were intended by the European powers for different reasons. But one of those reasons was as a policy of the European powers to get rid of unwanted people by sending them to the Ottoman Empire. And here we're mainly talking about Jewish citizens, and mainly Jewish Russian citizens. So Jewish Russian citizens, because the Tsar of Russia preferred that they would emigrate, preferred that they would leave, and he met with Zionist leaders, then he put pressure on the Ottoman Empire to give Jewish Russian citizens extra rights, privileges that normal Ottomans don't receive. And that contributed to establishing a small community of Jews of East European origin. So remember, Russia was very big at the time and controlled also vast areas of what we call today Ukraine and Poland and so on. And these people came to Palestine, and they were able to start building without permits, for example, building houses without a permit, because when Ottoman police officers or authorities came to enforce the law, they realized that they don't have the authority that they have on normal Ottoman citizens, because the foreign citizens living in Palestine had the right to be tried in a court of their own nationality. That means they would have to go to a Russian court, for example. So here we already start to see a little bit of tension. Here we already see a beginning of groups of European Jews coming to Palestine, taking over some land, building houses illegally, or actually legally, but the law was very unjust, and the relation with the local Palestinian population was very complex and went through different phases. At the first stage, it was a very classical colonial relationship between colonists and natives, by which the Jewish colonists said, we want to establish a farm and we need workers, and we're going to pay Palestinian workers to work in our farm. Palestinians were free to work there if they wanted or not if they didn't want, and they were happy to get the new jobs, and it was not considered to be an act of hostility. But very quickly we're moving to a second stage with the rise of socialist Zionism. Socialist Zionism said this model of classical colonialism is not right for us, and a more just model would be if we the Jews, we the Jewish colonists, would actually do the work. So we need to conquer the work, conquer the labor, and exclude the Palestinians from the farms and work also as the day workers in those farms. At that moment, of course, Palestinians started to feel that something is happening which is threatening their existence in that area, because now they cannot work in the colonies anymore. But they were not, don't get the wrong impression as if that happened overnight. Obviously, Palestinians continued to work for Jewish colonists throughout that entire time. And therefore, there were many different opinions among Palestinians how they should respond to these newcomers. Should they accept them as the new Palestinians? Just a kind of new emerging middle class in Palestine of people coming from Europe and bringing money and bringing European religions and ideas to Palestine. Why not? Or maybe they should see them as foreign invaders, or maybe they should see them as part of the colonial empire's attempt to carve out the world and the Middle East as part of that world into sections. Or maybe they should see them as a religious invasion, an attempt to convert their land into a foreign religion, and they should fight in the name of their own religions against it. So there were many different opinions. When the British Empire comes, that's when things start to change, because Lord Balfour, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the British Crown, makes this declaration. It's a very short declaration saying Her Majesty's government sees favorably the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine, a Jewish homeland, but, and here's the second part, without taking any of the rights or without harming in any way the non-Jewish population of Palestine. This text has been analyzed so much and had so much of an impact. First of all, it's interesting how in the Israeli historical discourse, only the first part of the text is remembered. Regardless of how short it is, people tend to remember that it had a second part. And so they only remember that Jews would have a homeland. What exactly does a homeland mean? Of course, in the Zionist tradition, the interpretation of Jewish homeland means a Jewish state, and not that Jews would be equal citizens in a kind of Palestinian state. But also, I think it's interesting to see how the text already shows what was Palestine in the eyes of the British Empire, how they considered that area. It was a country where with about 30,000 Jews, or 50,000, when Lord Balfour makes this declaration, and about 500,000 Palestinians who are not Jewish. And the text says, we have the Jews and we have the non-Jews. Somehow the 500,000 people are the minority and the 50,000 are the majority. And this we have to understand within the context of the British Empire being ruled by a colonial ideology which is also extremely racist and extremely Christian. One of the members of the British cabinet at the time was Lord Montagu, who was Jewish. And Lord Montagu protested loudly and vigorously against the Balfour Declaration. And he said, you're only making this declaration in order to alienate and to dispossess the British Jews. What do you mean a Jewish homeland in Palestine? No, no, no. My homeland is here in Britain, says Lord Montagu, and being ignored. And the British Empire immediately begins to develop a strategy for Palestine, which considers this two sides, as if there are two communities that needs to be addressed, the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community, and they bring in experts and they bring in police officers and they bring in people who learn both Hebrew and Arabic, and their intelligence services infiltrate both the Jewish community and the Palestinian community. And so they create what we now call the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because they start to imagine as if these are two groups. The British completely ignore the fact that there are also Palestinian Jews. There are Jews living in Palestinian cities like Jaffa and Nablus and Haifa, who are not part of the Zionist movement and didn't come from Europe, and they lived there for many generations. Also in Jerusalem and Tiberias and Safat and so on. The list is long, but the point is that for the British Empire, these people are transparent. They don't accept this category that you can be Jewish and Palestinian at the same time. And so until today, it's very unusual for people to think about this category of Jewish Palestinians, although these people exist and they still exist today. And like in every British colony around the world, the key to British superiority and control is divide and conquer. The British Empire divided Cyprus to north and south. They divided North America to north and south, what we call today Canada and the United States. They divided India between Pakistan and India. Every British colony has this story, and Palestine is no different. And so when the British are ready to leave after many rebellions, which were, again, rebellions both by Palestinians and by Jews, sometimes fighting side by side, sometimes fighting against each other, trying to kick out the British and create an independent state. The British said, well, we're not sure that we really need that state at all, especially after the Second World War. And they recommend to the United Nations what they recommend for every former British colony: partition. And the idea of partition based on ethnic lines is an idea that is, of course, a recipe for war. And even though it's presented as a recipe against war, but instead of creating a political system where people can resolve their problems through a political process, it creates a border where soldiers stand on both sides of the border, and if you have some conflict to resolve, you resolve it by shooting at each other. And this is the partition plan of the United Nations, creating two states, Palestine and Israel. This is the first time that we have a new state. Actually, the United Nations did not imagine that the Jewish state will be called Israel. They said we will create a Jewish state. And it was a sort of a trick, or I would say a very aggressive move by first Prime Minister Ben-Gurion to call his state Israel. And the reason is that the word Israel had a different meaning until 1948. The word Israel just meant Jewish. People called themselves, I am of Israel, I am Israel, meaning I am Jewish, regardless of what their nationality was. This is something that even the National Socialists, the Nazis, understood the word like that. They understood that Jews are using the word Israel interchangeably with the word Jewish. So as part of their policy to mark people as Jews, to brand them so that they would be easily recognizable, everybody knows about the yellow star, the Star of David, that people were forced to wear visibly on their clothes under Nazi rule. But also, they changed the names of all the men. The official name in the passports or in the documents of all men who didn't already have a clearly Jewish name. So if somebody's already called Yossi or Shmulik, then they can keep that name. But if their name sounds too Christian, maybe, or then their name was changed to Israel, to Israel. So now there is a new state called Israel, and there should be also a state called Palestine. And the UN comes up with this map, which divides the land 50-50, because when you don't know better, then you just say, why not 50-50? Even though the population was absolutely not divided 50-50. If you look at every atlas, every map of the world before 1948, you can see a country called Palestine. Suddenly, the United Nations suggests that there will only be half of that Palestine left, and the other half would be a Jewish state, which David Ben-Gurion says this will be called Israel. And even though it will be less populated because the Palestinian side has more people, that will change because many Jews will come to the side called Israel, and that justifies the fact that they get more land per person than the Palestinians. So I think this is a moment of history how we see the colonial legacy determines the borders of the Middle East in a very similar way to how the colonial legacy determines the borders of Africa that we know today, and Latin America and Asia and so on. So in that case, Palestine is no exception. But there is another issue here, which is very important, which is that the Holocaust has come to an end in 1945. There are Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. Also, of course, many survivors of the Holocaust who were not Jewish. I'm now focusing on the Jewish survivors because this is the topic that we're discussing. And the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust need a place to come back to. And they are citizens of Poland and Czechoslovakia and Germany and France and so on. Now, when the United Nations makes that vote for the partition, remember, the United Nations was a much, much smaller organization back then. Most of the countries that are now members of the United Nations did not exist in 1948. Those were European, it was dominated by European states, which all had this problem. How do you rehabilitate people that you have betrayed so badly? How can the Polish and German and French government now say to their Jewish citizens, well, try to forget what happened when we killed off entire populations, entire communities, and now you're just a normal citizen of our country. How exactly do you now reintegrate people into your society, educate the population about what happened without singling out these people? How do you compensate these people and give them back their property and also the means to rebuild their lives after this massive genocide? And here comes the Zionist movement, and David Ben-Gurion is the most prominent figure, and says, I am offering to you European powers, to you European states, an easy solution. Why don't you send your Jews to me? And indeed, this is a very compelling argument. And indeed, the decision of most European states to vote in favor of the partition plan and to completely gloss over all of the problems, all of the colonial legacy, all of the issue that many Jews around the world reject Zionism and do not think that Jews should move to Palestine. They ignore all that and they decide to go with the easy solution. Let's make it somebody else's problem. And so again, if we go back to this idea of what is the Israel-Palestinian conflict, in a way, it is to turn the Palestinians into the heirs of the European problem, of the European identity problem and the problem with racism and extreme nationalism that has brought to this extreme stage of the Holocaust. And instead of dealing with that problem and resolving it, let's just push it over on the Palestinians. And now, and this is also why you have this image of these two sides, as if the Palestinians are somehow equivalent to the European powers. What the current Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu loves to compare Palestinians with Nazis on every occasion. And that also helps to diffuse the fact, or to obfuscate the fact, that Jews in Europe were victimized and targeted, and they were almost powerless to defend themselves. But Jews in Palestine are not powerless. Jews in Palestine are the more powerful side, and they have a strong army and weapons and so on. And so this image of the victim is now exploited in order to justify those crimes. And this, of course, culminates in the War of 1948, which the Israelis call the War of Independence, and the Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. And this war, actually starting already in 1947, I think in many ways has the forms of a civil war. Because both Palestinians and Jews living in Palestine were subjects of the British Empire. The British left, and several Arab armies from surrounding countries marched into Palestine in order to prevent the partition plan and in order to prevent the establishment of what they considered a European colony in the Middle East, in the center of the Middle East. But this is not how the fighting looked like. You know, this is the historical narrative that we often learn, that the newly born state of Israel with its newly born army staved off an invasion from all of their neighbors and somehow miraculously defeated them all and became independent. That's absolutely not what actually happened there. What actually happened was a very bitter and vicious fighting in many, many different areas, and there was no front line exactly, because the fighting happened in places like Jaffa and Haifa, so cities which were nowhere near Egypt or Syria or Jordan. and where various militia groups were fighting to establish their area. But one militia group became very, very dominant with a lot of international support, with superior weapons, and that was the Haganah. The Haganah is the forefather of the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF. The Haganah was, and the commander of the Haganah was David Ben-Gurion. I'm getting back to this man again and again, who gave the order for his soldiers to say, you're not just fighting now to defend our state. You're fighting to change how the state is going to look like. And you have to make sure that you don't leave Palestinian villages and towns within our state. We want our area to be purely Jewish. That was not successful, but it was almost successful. The majority of the Palestinians were kicked out in the greatest ethnic cleansing in the history of Palestine, with about 750,000 people being forced to leave their homes, their property confiscated by the newly established State of Israel, and the partition plan completely ignored, and instead of 50-50 like the UN wanted, it becomes 80-20. 80% of the land becomes what we know now as the State of Israel. 20% is then conquered by Egypt and Jordan. So actually there is no State of Palestine anymore. Anymore. There's not been a State of Palestine for 1 second, actually. And the State of Israel now tries to rewrite what happened and to rebrand this moment as a struggle against imperialism, as an anti-imperial fight, like so many countries in North Africa and in Asia fighting against British colonialism. India just won its independence 1 year before. And so they say, okay, now we are also part of that movement and we've also become independent, forgetting that they didn't really fight against the British, they fought against the native people of that land.